Welcome back to Lisa Study Guides, guys. I wanted to say a big thank you to everybody who came to last week's reading and comparing live stream. And if you weren't there, or if you don't know I do live streams, well, what are you doing? Go ahead and subscribe down below so that you can get notifications. Actually, you have to press the bell button to get notifications these days. So if you want to do that, then go ahead, because that's when you know when my live streams are. Live streams are fantastic because I feel like you guys are actually asking me the questions you really care about, and there's the opportunity for me to go into detail with those questions and answers for you. So I'm really looking forward to our next live stream, which is going to be also about reading comparing. So it's just going to be an extension, but this time we're going to be talking about how to brainstorm essay topics. So last time was more about how you should explore ideas when it comes to actually comparing two different texts, but this time we're looking more at the essay side of things. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's look into today's reading and comparing topic, which will be based on tracks and Into the Wild. So previously I've also done a video on Ransom and Invictus, which is basically a novel and a film that was being compared, and it's the same in today's case as well, another novel and another film. So I'm sure you guys will be able to find something new and fresh in the discussion that we have today. So let's go straight into the background information. Robin Davidson's Tracks is a true story of a perilous trek across 1,700 miles of Australian outback. The events of the story begin in 1973, with a young Robin Davidson arriving in Alice Springs with an outlandish plan to train wild camels to accompany her through the Australian desert. When, after 2 years of grueling training, she receives a sponsorship from National Geographic, her journey can finally go ahead, on the condition that a photography accompany her and document parts of her journey. This compromise weighs heavily on Robin, as photographer Rick Smolin intrudes on her solitude and compromises everything the trip means to her. While an unlikely friendship develops, it becomes an endearing one. As Robin delves deeper into the journey, every day brings new discoveries about the camels, the landscape, the people of Australia, and ultimately herself. Tracks emerges as a candid and compelling story of a woman's odyssey of discovery and transformation. Sean Penn's film, Into the Wild, depicts the true story of the life and death of Christopher McCandless. A bright young college student in the 1990s, McCandless abandoned his family and affluent lifestyle to embark on a frontier-style journey into the Alaskan wilderness. Adopting the pseudonym Alexander Supertramp, and rejecting material possessions and human relationships, he proclaims himself as an aesthetic voyager whose home is on the road. Troubled by a dysfunctional family and disenchanted with the materialistic excess of 1980s America, McCandless seeks a radical engagement with nature in the style of his literary heroes Henry David Thoreau and Jack London. After 113 days in the wilderness, he suffers from starvation and dies. The true story of McCandless's journey renders the film an important depiction of self-reliance, isolation, and the unparalleled power of nature. Themes: self-discovery in nature. Both texts are concerned with the notion of self-discovery. Robin and Chris find themselves in a social context with which they are at odds, leading them to feel profoundly disconnected. Nature presents an escape route for both protagonists, an opportunity to engage with an alternative set of values and test the limits of their emotional and physical strength. The Australian desert is a brutal force with which Robin must contend. Here she encounters wild bulls, vast stretches of complete isolation, and the unpredictable natures of her camels. When Robin encounters Mr. Eddie and learns about Indigenous Australian people, she begins to become one with herself and the land. Robin's ability to learn from her environment and adapt to it is the necessary factor in her ability to survive and grow on this difficult journey. Chris, however, is drawn to the romantic literary notion of nature. Inspired by Thoreau and London, Chris seeks enlightenment in the wild. Despite a philosophical understanding of the power of nature, Chris believes he can survive the untamed wilderness of Alaska. Although nature is the locus for self-realization and growth for Chris, it's also what destroys him. As the viewer watches him slowly deteriorate, we come to fully comprehend the force of nature, suggesting man's inability to control it. Isolation. Both Robin and Chris identify complete isolation as the only way to truly connect with the landscape they're immersed in. Robin is profoundly affected by Rick's intrusion into both her physical and emotional space, while Chris states that it is wrong to think that the joy of life comes principally from human relationships. For Robin and Chris, independence equates to freedom. Yet both tumultuous journeys reveal that no individual can be completely free from the need for others. Both Robin and Chris experience formative relationships in their travels, which further their own personal transformations. Even in Robin's longest stretches of isolation, she personifies her animals, drawing them into the human relationships she unintentionally craves. Her time with Mr. Eddie exposes her to the harsh reality of the living conditions of Indigenous Australians throughout the 1970s, as well as inspiring a deep appreciation for the culture and connection with the land. While Chris is deeply scarred by his relationship with his family, the authentic relationships he forms along the road with people like Rainey and Jan inform his eventual realization that happiness is only real when shared with others. Characters. Both Robin Davidson and Christopher McCandless are products of the time period in which they live, and reject the concept of adhering to a predetermined notion of who they should be and how they should behave. Both embark on their journey because they reject the expectations of their class and gender. Chris sees his father as an example of what he is expected to become, while Robin rebels against the concept that women should find contentment in motherhood and marriage. Davidson is a fiercely independent, solitary, and troubled character. She struggles with her identity and values, at times seems incongruous with the wider world. Her dependence on her animals suggests her inability to engage in healthy human relationships. Davidson's connection with the land and the Indigenous Australian people she encounters is central to the story, yet is in constant tension with her disdain for the media attention she receives, which infiltrates the sanctity of her journey and relationships with Indigenous peoples. As the memoir draws to an end, the audience see Robin emerge as a stronger, more determined woman who has embraced herself and her new identity. Christopher McCandless is a similarly complex character. He is gregarious, intense, and intelligent. He seeks a solitary life, but paradoxically, makes relationships easily and leaves a strong impression on all those he encounters. Chris manifests as a more restless, stubborn, idealistic character than Robin. His desire to immerse himself in nature and abandon all material possessions suggests a need to punish his parents for his volatile upbringing. There is a regressive and dysfunctional quality about McCandless. He is angry with the world despite his relatively fortunate upbringing, and distrusts human relationships so deeply that he drives himself into fatal isolation. Historical context. When you're studying these texts, it is essential to understand the historical context in which they take place. Tracks is set in the late 1970s, an era of intense social and political change in Australia. The second wave feminist movements of the 1960s and 70s were enormously influential in Australia, as women began to dismantle the sexist structures inherent in Australian society at this time. Davidson describes Alice Springs as hopelessly in the grips of a cult of misogyny. She rejects the archetype of the passive, docile woman. She is passionately determined to shed her own sense of self as traditionally feminine, a quality she sees as arising from being trained from birth to be dogmatish. Tracks is not an explicitly feminist text, but it clearly echoes the philosophies of feminism. In the years since the trek, Robin Davidson has become a feminist symbol of defiance, endurance, and strength. Thus, to consider Tracks from a feminist perspective is important when studying this text. Davidson's criticism of Australian misogyny inform our understanding of this historical context and the significance of her actions. So in a few weeks, I'll actually be releasing a video that's really relevant to feminist perspectives. It's going to be about unique interpretations and how you can look at critical perspectives, so either a feminist perspective or looking at it from a post-colonial or postmodernism perspective, and how that might actually influence the way that you understand the text. so stay tuned for that one. While Into the Wild is set in the 1990s, McCandless's formative years were in the 1980s, a decade characterized by the consumerism, extravagance, and materialism of President Reagan's America. The reverberating effects of this time period inform McCandless' general outlook and disdain for American society. Important things to consider. Because this is a comparison between a film and a book, we must consider the textual elements that set them apart. The narrative structure is central to both texts and is a fundamental element of how we perceive the protagonist. An important aspect of Into the Wild is to consider that McCandless's story, while true, is told through Sean Penn's directional lenses, which is in turn based on John Krakauer's book. The story is informed by McCandless's writings and interviews with those who knew him, but it is ultimately a work of artistic interpretation. Consider how this affects a viewer's perception of Chris. Does this raise questions around representation and identity? This is in direct contrast to Track, which is a first-person, linear past tense, autobiographical account of the writer's experience. Where Robin is completely in control of her narrative, McCandless is subject to the artistic interpretation of others. Another important thing to consider is Robin's repeated personification of the animals she encounters. The camels in particular take on their own human personalities in her life. This technique, called anthropomorphism, can be used to complement a discussion of the theme of isolation. Davidson's depiction of her dependence on animals reveals deeper meanings about her inability to depend on and communicate with humans in the same way. A recurring symbol in Into the Wild is literature. Chris takes many novels into the wilderness, and each book speaks a part of his philosophy. Henry David Thoreau's Walden is central to Chris's conception of the wild. The book is a reflection upon simple living nature. Thoreau encourages solitary life and civil disobedience. Consider Chris's romantic perception of nature in contrast to Robin's grounded, temporal understanding of her environment. Both Into the Wild and Tracks are fascinating, deeply complex texts that explores intricate symbols and powerful quotes. A comparison of these texts has the potential to be a sophisticated, nuanced discussion of human nature. Consider the messages that both texts are trying to portray. What are they trying to say to us as their audience? Write your comments down below. I'd love to hear your understanding of these texts. So until I see you guys next time, have an awesome week. Bye!